Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor, and I just want to quilt. Today we talk to Cindy Turnbow of the Stencil Company. She is the owner of the Stencil Company. We also interviewed her father, who is a famous quilter and designer, just before we talked with her, so we may chat a little bit about that. And she talks about the business of being in the business of stencils, and she's great. I hope you enjoy it. Tell me who you are and where you are.
My name is Cynthia Turnbow, and I'm in Natrona Heights, Pennsylvania, which is just outside Pittsburgh.
Yes. And how's the
weather? And I'm with the Stencil. I'm with the Stencil Company.
And with the Stencil Company. The Stencil Company is super interesting to me for a number of reasons, but I learned about you when I was in a long arm class because they said, just look for the ones that are blue, which I thought was so insanely awesome because that's kind of what I do is trademark and trade dress, and the fact that everybody knew you because you have blue ones, blue stencils, is really fascinating to me. So you had me hooked at blue. So tell me, we're going to start with the very first question, which is, what's your first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
Wow, someone's sewing or quilting. Probably from a very, very early age, because my father was a tailor when he first went into the military, or did some tailoring. He was actually a chaplain's assistant, and as a child, we lived overseas in Africa because he worked for the government, and he would make all of our clothes. So I can remember my father sitting at the sewing machine and making our clothes. When we got back to the States, he would even make our winter. He made everything he possibly could. So from the time I have any memory of him sewing, he had always made my clothes until it got to the point I could make my own.
That's really interesting. That's when did you ever sew? You made your own clothes, so did you like sewing, and did you continue sewing as well?
Oh, I absolutely loved it. And I even made all of my daughter's clothes when she started elementary school. We would go to Quilt Market where, the vendors would come in and sell their merchandise wholesaler. They would take orders, and the larger fabric company that my father designed merchandise for would skirt their tables with the newest fabric. And if he would go over with a pair of scissors and a staple remover, he could take all of the fabric off the tables at Quilt Market, and he'd make a pile in the middle of my booth, and we would take it home, and I'd chop it up and make clothes for my daughter for school for the whole year. We called it tablecloth fabric, but it was actually the latest fabric from Hoffman, was her entire wardrobe for the year.
So you grew up at Quilt. Your family is Quilt Market in some way. That's so funny that would be part of your life. That's amazing. So do you feel like you just grew up in the quilt industry? And the quilt industry kind of grew up. The change in the quilt industry since 1976 is kind of remarkable to me, and you've lived through that. Did you feel it shifting during that time period?
I've been in business for 30 years now. It absolutely has. When I first got into the business, if anybody machine quilted, you really didn't know about it. And they were doing it in their sewing room on a domestic tabletop sewing machine. You really didn't have long arm machines at that time. So you had a lot of people who were buying stencils for hand quilting. And I've noticed just within the last 10 years that more and more people are now machine quilting, and trying to find hand quilters is very difficult. You have to really go search on the internet to find a group of people who are hand quilting. People who do machine quilt can buy products from us that are geared for not only hand but machine quilting, and then in our stencils, but then we also carry some pantographs, which the long arm quilters use. But even then, I go to quilt shows and I'll stand there in the booth, and I always hear people walk by the booth and say things like, I have enough, I don't need any more, or I can get this cheaper if I go online, why do I need to pay for it at the quilt show? So yes, I have noticed that people aren't buying as much. And when you go and you look at these surveys that are coming out that are conducted by some of these larger companies, you see that the number of quilters that are answering these surveys in the U.S. are, since 2010 have dropped by over 50%, the number of people who are saying that they're quilting anymore, and the amount of money that they're spending on average now is like $500 a year, which, my gosh, you used to wish you could make that off one person in your booth at a trade show, which just doesn't happen anymore. So yeah, we're noticing a major shift. People used to say that in the quilting industry, every 7 years or whenever there was an election, you would notice a downturn in the industry. And you would assume that you were going to have at least a 20 to 25% loss in your revenue stream just during that time period. And it was really devastating when those two, landed on the exact same year. You had an election and that 7-year time period hit at the same time. And then at that time, you would count on probably a 40% drop in your revenue stream. But we have all noticed just by talking amongst ourselves that about every year for about the past 4 years, the industry has dropped by 20% every year.
Wow.
So the trade shows, you're taking in a lot less money, yet the booth rent is going up. Our online sales are up while our trade show revenue is down. But you feel like you need to go to the trade shows because in order to remain relevant in the industry, you have to put yourself out there. But it kind of gets to the point that a lot of the vendors are dropping larger shows because it's too expensive to go. They're doing smaller guild shows. They're not taking in as much money. Their profit margin's greater. Their booth rent's only, say, $300 versus $3,000. So you find that happening. But you get to the point where you kind of feel like you're on a PR tour because you're just standing there smiling and not really selling anything. So I have seen that in the industry. I just think that there aren't as many quilters and they have too much product already. So
that's really interesting. And tell me about how did you get into the stencil business?
I was divorced with I guess my daughter would have been a year at the time, and I was sewing for some friends. I had a degree from college, but I couldn't get a job in my field, so I was sewing for a friend of mine, and my dad was doing some design work for a stencil manufacturing company up in Canada, and they were only selling wholesale to quilt shops in the U.S., and they wanted to have a retail presence down here, but they had promised the quilt shops that they would not sell retail within the United States. But they approached my dad and said, but we never said we wouldn't sell wholesale to someone who could do mail order retail. So would your daughter be interested? And anyone who knows my dad, when he has a big idea, you usually run the other way because there's a lot of work involved in one of his big ideas. But this one actually panned out. And I said I'd give it a year because I just couldn't imagine anybody would want to buy a piece of plastic with holes cut into it. And here I am 30 years later and still in the business. So I started very small. We only had about, maybe 50 or 60 designs in our catalog, and we could work with a single booth. And now we've got over 2,500 products in our catalog and have a real social media presence. And so that's how I got started.
That's amazing. And why are they blue?
The company up in Canada always cut on blue stencils because that was their trademark. And when I purchased from them, initially I only purchased their designs. I didn't have any of my own. When I started incorporating some of my own designs into it, they were more than happy to cut on the blue plastic for me because it was a trademark. Well, they went out of business maybe about 20, 25 years ago. And when I brought all of my design work down to the States and employed a company in Ohio to cut for me, I just stuck with the blue because, as you said, someone said, buy the blue stencils, that's our trademark.
Yeah.
There was a company out there at one time that cut theirs on green. There are two companies that cut on white. So, yeah, the blue was just a good thing to stick with because it was, a trademark. And I do have people say, oh, my gosh, I know who you are now. I see your blue stencils in the box there. I know exactly who you are. So.
And it's we'll put pictures up on the website, but it's so beautiful and so distinct with the booth because it's just this beautiful sea of blue, which you can see from like very far away. It's really, it's exactly how trade dress and trademark is supposed to work, right? That you go, I'm looking for the blue ones. And you find them.
That's right.
It's great. Now, what about competition? Do you find that you are having now? I imagine that the manufacturing process has gotten easier for stencils over time. do you find that there's more competition for stencils than there was when you started?
No, there is not. There's only one other company. Well, there's two other companies in the U.S. that sell stencils. One has he cuts his own in his basement, has a very limited line of stencils. And then the person who manufactures my stencils is actually a distributor as well. He sells not only to quilt shops and wholesale distributors like, Checker and Ohio, but he also does a very small retail business. But most of his business is selling to wholesalers. He actually also sells to like Joann's. They have a contract with some of the larger, larger stores. I don't know if he sells to any other fabric stores besides Joann's, if he'd ever sold to Hancock's before they went out of business. But I know I've seen his product in Joann's. I can't handle that kind of volume because I still run my business from my home. I don't find that there's really any competition from them because they're not as involved in the retail industry as I am. They don't do trade shows. The gentleman who cuts his own in his basement, I don't find there's any competition with him because people have told me since he's cutting in very limited quantities, his prices are a lot higher than ours. We keep our prices at the suggested retail price because we never want to add anything to the suggested retail to cover shipping so we can offer free shipping because we don't feel it's fair to people who are coming to the quilt show to have to pay a higher price so those who order over the internet could get free shipping. Mm-hmm. So our prices are very, very reasonable. And no, I really don't find there's any competition because 9 times out of 10, I'll be the only stencil vendor at a quilt show anyway.
That's really interesting. And so tell me about sort of the economics of the stencil. So you've got standard stencils. You're designing new stencils, I would imagine. And then what's the cost? There are
stencils that have been designed by either my father or my daughter. We also carry, if she's an artist, we also carry stencils from different designers around the country. Some we have gotten permission to cut their designs in the blue plastic. We also buy stencils from our manufacturer. His are on white plastic, so he has some designers that he pays royalties to that he cuts for, and we buy some of their designs as well. Many of the designs that we carry are in the public domain. They have been in books. They've been cut into cardboard like back in the 1800s. We'll go to antique stores. We'll find the paper stencils that someone's great-great-grandmother cut and used on every quilt, and we'll make a stencil out of that. We've had people who've gone to estate sales and bought boxes of old paper stencils and sent them to us, and we've cut them. Normally, that's what we do. We don't just take a design that we see in a book and cut it because for copyright purposes, you obviously can't do that. If we have a stencil or have a quilter approach us and say, I'd like to have this stencil cut, it's in my book, then we negotiate with them to go ahead and have our manufacturer cut the design, and then they buy them through us. But most of the designs that we have are in the public domain.
That's really interesting. And then do you feel like you want to protect them so that others don't use them, or do you recognize they're in the public domain and that what you're providing is a convenience on the stencil, right? That it's...
I'm sorry. Repeat the question.
I guess what I'm saying is, since you know they're in the public domain, does the status of the work change when it is put into a stencil? Do you feel like, okay, well, it was in the public domain, but now as a stencil, we should protect it in some way? Like, how do you feel about it once it's in a stencil? Oh no, you can't. I can't protect anything in the public domain. I can't copyright anything or trademark anything that's in the public domain. Now, original artwork from my father or my daughter, we do copyright. We have copyright through the Copyright Office. We've got all of our certificates. We copyright everything as a collection. We're not like fabric manufacturers where they will say, well, if you win the top prize of $15,000, you have to recognize the designer, the quilter, the fabric company, blah, 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 the pattern designer. Everybody needs recognition. We give people permission, and it's in our statement that you can use these stencils, any way that you want to. There's no limitation on how they can be used. I mean, because we all know it doesn't matter what you say or how many restrictions you put on your design. It's going to end up in China, and somebody's going to put it on every quilt that's in a Holiday Inn, and there's not much you can do about it. I will have people, if they submit something to a show for judging, they will say, like one of our pre-printed designs is from the stencil company or designed by Hollis Turnbow, my dad.
But no, I give people free rein to use them any way that they want to. If they use my stencil in a book, say someone's writing a book about how to use a type of ruler and they're using our stencils with it, they will contact me, because I do have a limitation on that, and say, may I use your stencil in my book? And we just say, as long as you give